The manga was better. If you've ever talked to someone about anime, that phrase has probably come up. Of course, none of you people talk to anyone in your daily lives. That's why you're here, seeking out some sort of parasocial relationship with a stranger online. Don't worry, I promise not to take advantage of your loneliness. I mean, this video isn't even sponsored. But it could have been. Gunslinger Girl might be one of those instances of the anime surpassing the manga. But now I have to say might because some people will tell you that the anime does a poor job adapting the manga. And one of those people happens to be the author.
There is no better place to be.
Gunslinger Girl is a manga written by Yu Ida in 2002 and adapted into an anime by Madhouse the very next year of The Hobbit 2003. It follows a secret Italian government organization that uses cybernetically enhanced and psychologically brainwashed little girls to fight terrorists and mobsters. Each girl is assigned to a handler, a man who is responsible for all her training, maintenance, and conditioning. These girls typically come with a terrible past. Some had diseases or defects that couldn't be cured, while others were victims of abuse and human trafficking. The cybernetic augmentations greatly benefit these girls. The agency can fix up their eyesight, recreate lost limbs, or just make all those bad memories disappear. But everything has its price, and the price these girls have to pay for their new lives is just that. Their lives. They are entirely devoted to this sham social welfare agency and to their handlers. They might look like cute, innocent little girls, but they're hardly human thanks to all the experiments and missions. Each of them has been trained to kill their target, no matter who that target might be, and each of them is very eager to please her handler. A handler who might be emotionally distant or physically abusive, or maybe a seemingly kind older brother figure, but one who still puts a gun in her hand and an enemy in her sights. Gunslinger Girl is not a happy anime. There are certainly happy moments here and there, but it's always accompanied by a quiet realization that these girls live a terrible life. I mean, they're Italian for Christ's sake, but also their lives are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. They're put on the front lines in delicate operations. Every day could be their last, and even if they survive the mission, they might still be subjected to more surgeries and conditioning, which take a toll on their lifespans. The only solace these girls can find is in each other to some degree, and with their handlers. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to label the relationship between a handler and his gunslinger as Leon the Professional-esque, but it's not uncommon for these girls to develop a one-sided affection. We will be coming back to this later. Gunslinger Girl is one of those titles that has a name which conjures a certain type of image in my mind. It's very anime. Little girls with big guns shooting bad guys, I mean, come on, that's classic stuff. But the Gunslinger Girl anime from 2003 doesn't really fit with that image. Sure, it's still girls with guns, but it's more interested in the girl part than the gun part. And I'm not talking about Yuri. One might even say it's a show where the girls are guns, and not in a fun, over-the-top kind of way, but in a more tragic sense. Like, here's a show where something as pure and innocent as a little girl has been turned into something as violent and lifeless as a gun. You'll notice I haven't really talked about the plot or the bad guys because that's not the focus of this show. And that might bother some of you, especially if you're more interested in world building. But I look at it like this. Who the enemy is doesn't matter to these girls. The enemy is whoever the agency tells them is the enemy. They don't need to think about it, they just need to do their job. You could even say that the show is intentionally avoiding labeling one side as the ultimate good guys and the other as the irredeemable evil guys. It keeps things messy by having these supposed good guys sometimes employ terrible tactics and the alleged bad guys often recite noble goals. Now, I'm not trying to say that this makes the show better than the simple stories. On the contrary, I very much enjoy the simple stories. But I do think this gray moral framework fits with the hazy, murky world of Gunslinger Girl. The lack of black and white answers gives those little moments between characters more weight and meaning. It's purposely ambiguous, just like with the good guys and the bad guys. Not all the bad guys, obviously. Some of them are just hot-headed gangsters, but you get what I mean. The show wants you to question the nature of the agency, and it wants you to feel bad for these girls. And it worked. It's a very sad show that knows how to melancholy max. The muted style removes all the color and warmth in the world. The soft classical music lends itself to the slow, often calm interactions set in sterile rooms in gloomy Italian towns and cities. And the VAs always managed to deliver even the mundane lines with just a tinge of depression. It wasn't as excessive as something like Psycho, and it was more subtle than something like Elfen Lied. It was perfect, beautifully tragic and thought-provoking, and not what Yu Ida wanted. What he wanted was, apparently, Season 2. We'll get into why Ida didn't like Season 1 in a minute, but to really understand his reasoning, we're gonna have to look at Season 2 first. You'll notice there's a 5-year gap in between these seasons. That's usually a sign that something was going on behind the scenes. And what was going on behind the scenes was a studio change. Madhouse was out and Artland was in. Not familiar with them? Well, they're a studio that went bankrupt in 2017. But before that, they made Mushishi, the old Legend of the Galactic Heroes anime, and, yeah, that's really about it, to be honest. Along with a change in studio was a noticeable change in style. The eyes got bigger, the colors got brighter, and the animation got worse. It's not just the visuals that changed either, the characters changed too. And I don't mean that they swapped out the old cast for a new team, although it kind of feels like it. Take Riko, for instance. In Season 1, she's pretty shy and unsure of herself around her handler because he expects perfection and treats her like a tool instead of a girl. And unlike his brother who tends to coddle and dote on his state-issued little sister, his methods of correction can often be extreme. But even though she's not the best at doing her job and often doesn't want to do her job, she will always do her job. And then she comes back to her room at the agency and wakes up with tears in her eyes as she repeats the lie that she's so very happy that her body is still hers and that she gets to work at the agency. That's how she is in Season 1. But in Season 2, she gleefully smiles while torturing people. You can more or less do this analysis for every member of the cast. The characterization feels completely off for just about all of them. And the little characterization that's carried over from the first season isn't handled very well either. There's no ambiguity to their actions. There's way less to think about in general. But now how can that be when the author himself was heavily involved in this version of the show, whereas all he did in the last one was sign off on the thing? Well, I think the answer is that Ida didn't get his own story. I recognize that's a very presumptuous thing to say, but I'm not saying that the guy was a total hack. I'm saying that he had a good idea, but he needed someone else to show him just how good that idea actually was. I can't help but notice that so much of what I and many others love about Gunslinger Girl doesn't seem to actually be Gunslinger Girl. Remember how I said that the title of this anime conjured up a certain image? Well, it turns out that image is Gunslinger Girl. Season 2 was an attempt by Ida to course correct his series. I mentioned earlier that the new season changed the style, but that's not really true. Season 1 changed the style. All Season 2 did was follow the manga. That's why the girls look more cutesy and the guys look like K-pop stars. It's also why there's a bigger emphasis on little girls with big guns shooting bad guys. For what it's worth, the story is more focused. It mainly follows a singular small terrorist group in a linear fashion, unlike the first season, which jumped around every episode and featured a handful of villains who didn't get much development. But is that a good thing? I'm not convinced that it is. I don't think the main draw of a series like this should be the terrorists and the mobsters and the political factions. I think the main thing to focus on in a story called Gunslinger Girl is the Gunslinger Girls. That's what Season 1 did. Morio Asaka was someone who was already well versed in directing shows of a somewhat similar nature, and he had about 2 volumes of manga material to work with and no guarantee of a second season. So we looked over the chapters to see what he was working with, and what he saw was something tragic and depressing. A story about girls being used and abused. A story where they would say some terrible things and think nothing of it. Where they did terrible things and were often praised for it. The world was upside down. Men with military backgrounds hid behind little girls who were helpless to stop their identities from fading away with every person they killed and every mission they completed. They had next to nothing, but even then they could somehow find happy moments. But you never really knew if they were truly happy, if those feelings were real or just a side effect of their conditioning or their own delusions. You weren't given definite answers, you had to come up with your own conclusions by piecing together the reactions with some allusions to ancient myths and famous songs. This stuff is in the manga, but it feels either unpronounced or far too explicit. It lacks all the little touches that go a long way in making the characters feel personal and the world believable. And now I want to talk about that second part some more. The premise of Gunslinger Girl is frankly absurd. The government is using cyborg little girls to fight terrorism. That is a silly statement, and it makes it very difficult to take the subject matter seriously. And yet, I did take this show seriously. The somber tone, the mellow dialogue, the attention to detail in the environments and the action sequences, all of those things together made me forget how dumb the premise is. I mean, the show's not perfect. I still find myself wondering why the agency only uses little girls and not little boys, or how the technology they have at their disposal is so high-tech, but the only thing they seem to use it on is modifying children. But the idea behind Gunslinger Girl was always going to be unrealistic, so I gotta give props to Madhouse for making it feel as realistic as it could be. But that sense of realism isn't present in season 2. The tone is all over the place. It can go from a happy excursion to a toy shop to a brutal backstory just like that. The dialogue, which used to sound very reserved, now just sounds like standard stuff delivered with subpar performances.
何でも買い与えすぎかな。でも担当官に渡される経費はこの子の給料みたいなものだし。あの子は何をもらっても喜ぶから難しい。ヒルシャーはいつもぬいぐるみだから気楽だよな。
And lastly, the little details that are supposed to make this story feel grounded are all wrong. There's one point where there's this dramatic shot of Triella firing off her shotgun at some guy's head, but when the shot hits, there's no blood, just a bruise. At first I thought, oh, she must have used like rubber pellets or something, but then the very next shot she takes has some blood on impact. You might say this is a nitpick, but I don't think it is, especially for a show like this, which does pay a lot of attention to its firearms. And it's not just with guns, this problem is present in other aspects of the show as well. The characters can feel bipolar, the background stuff stands out in a bad way, and the music just doesn't fit half of the time. It's not a bad OST by any stretch. There are a few songs that I really like, including the opening and the ending songs, but the music in this anime doesn't bolster the atmosphere to the same degree as before. The classical score in season 1 perfectly set the melancholic mood, but with season 2, it almost feels like a campy mob film at times. The narrative might be more cohesive, and I've seen some praise thrown towards Pinocchio and the others, but I can't call season 2 anything other than a downgrade. I wouldn't call it terrible. I didn't even have to force myself to finish it because it's not actually that bad, aside from the action, but it's just so forgettable, aside from the infuriating stylistic choices. I don't know who thought it'd be a cool idea to have every flashback in this show be presented with a camera shake filter, but really bad things need to happen to that person. Surprisingly, it's all uphill after the first episode, but it never reaches the heights of season 1. And it's not like season 1 was perfect. The second episode heavily reuses footage from the first. It has its sins, but nothing it did ever compared to this. All in all, it's fine in the moment, I guess, but just forgettable. Or maybe I'm the one who's trying to forget. I don't know, I wouldn't say it's a meaningless waste of time because it clearly has something it wants to say, but it's mumbling the message. I guess you could call that subtle psychological introspection, but if it's so subtle that you can't even see it on the screen, then maybe things need to be changed. That's what season 1 did. It changed things. So much so that season 2 isn't really season 2. All the important events from season 1 are recapped over the course of the season, so you wouldn't even need to watch the old show to understand this one. Plus, season 1 took a lot of liberties with the source material. We see some things that never happened in the manga, and certain characters do other things that other characters were supposed to have done, and it's heavily implied that one of the characters dies in the finale, which again, did not happen in the manga. Madhouse was not only changing the characters in the story, but also redefining the aesthetic and the theme. I think that's why Aida changed studios. But now I have to say I think because I haven't been able to find anything concrete about why the change happened. The official wiki states that Yu Aida was pleased with what Madhouse put out, but the only sources it gives are the list of manga chapters and the list of anime episodes. In one interview I found for season 2, he doesn't even mention the first season, except to say that they've cleaned house and he's directly involved this time. That interview also briefly mentioned Aida's previous work, Bittersweet Fools, a visual novel also set in Italy which bore a striking similarity to what would eventually become Gunslinger Girl. Also, there's a lot of sex in the game. It's a hentai game. And once you find that out, you can't really look at Gunslinger Girl the same way again. Now, I'm not trying to imply that Aida was upset with Madhouse because they made these adult male and little girl pairings more grim and less, goony. All I am saying is that season 2 has a beach episode. Anyway, until next time, Ave Maria, Deus Volt, and a big thank you to all the cultured.